thank you very much for joining us for the penultimate panel of Think Tent. My name is Sam Collins. I am the head of Free Market Forum and the long-suffering senior advisor to the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Mark Littlewood. Delighted that you could all be here today. Thank you so much for joining us. Many of you will have seen either over the fantastic course of events that have run here at the Think Tent this year, or at the Great British Growth Rally yesterday. There is a call in the party, a demand for free market reform, for change of direction, at least for one wing of the party, at any rate. The question I want us to deal with today, and the reforms that have been discussed are anything from the future of the railways, to cutting spending, to reforming the National Health Service. But the question I want us to deal with today is whether or not an elected government can actually bring those changes to fruition. Is there the ability of a democratically elected government to make necessary reforms, or is the Whitehall Blob going to stand in the way and prevent any change actually occurring? And if I had to answer that question with four people, it would probably be the four people who are sitting up here. In order that they will be addressing you today, I want to start with Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. Sir Jacob is the Conservative MP for North East Somerset. He previously served as Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Minister of State for Brexit Opportunities and the Leader of the House of Commons. I'm sure he's very well known to all of you and is a great friend of both the IEA and the free market movement. Second, we have Alex Morton, who is the IEA's Director of Strategy. Alex was formerly the head of policy at the Centre for Policy Studies, I'm sure that is supposed to be, and special advisor to David Cameron on housing. He also worked for Policy Exchange as head of housing and as director for field consulting. Next, we have Greg Smith, who is the chairman of the Free Market Forum. He was very specific that he wanted it to be chairman, not politically correct, and just say chair of Free Market Forum. He is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Buckingham, and prior to being elected to Parliament in 2019, Greg worked in print design and marketing, serving clients across the manufacturing, medical technology and charity sectors, as well as he spent 14 years on the Hammersmith and Fulham Council. And finally, we have the Right Honourable Ranil Jayawardena, who was the Member of Parliament for North East Hampshire since 2015, and previously served as Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for International Trade. So Jacob, I'll ask you to kick us off, and we will go in order as previously said.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and I will also call you chairman rather than accusing you of being a piece of furniture. So thank you all for coming. Thank you. There's a lady who agrees with me. Thank you very much. It's actually a really difficult question. You're all expecting me to say, yes, there's this wicked blob. They're sort of like the triffids that if you're not looking, they come out and they will catch you and they will eat you somehow. But it's not as simple as that. There is obstruction in Whitehall, unquestionably. But what is the obstruction? Well, it's obstruction that we politicians have created for ourselves. We've passed a number of acts of Parliament that have fettered the discretion of ministers to do things and require us to do other things instead that we may not feel were part of our democratic mandate. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm obviously talking about things like the Climate Change Act, that they say that certain targets must be met. And the civil servant says to you, well, Minister, if you do that, you'll be breaking the law, therefore you cannot do it. But all we need to do is amend the Act of Parliament, because our system is still there. It is still functioning. We still have the supremacy of Parliament. There is no higher law than Parliament. When the judges interfere on a judicial review and say the minister did not have the power to do that, that is something we can deal with by passing another Act of Parliament or by not giving the power to the judges in the first place, by leaving it at ministerial discretion. But it's also the Human Rights Act that requires, on a document that has been deemed to be a living document, and therefore changes and evolves and is not the document that we thought we signed, that is used by civil servants to say, well, Minister, you can't do that either. So you have an obstructive blob that has been created by politicians and the Conservatives in 13 years have not destroyed. That, I think, is the real problem, is that we haven't legislated to give power back to ministers. And there's another part of this. New Labour was very clever. We may not have liked them, but they were unquestionably bright. What was pretty much the first thing Tony Blair did? Not quite. Not that either, no. An order in council. An order in council that allowed two special advisors, one called Alistair Campbell, to give orders directly to civil servants. What is almost the last act that comes in under Gordon Brown? It's a Civil Service Act that makes it illegal for special advisors ever to give orders to civil servants. So, New Labour set up a system where their civil servants could be bossed around by their special advisors, and they then changed the law as they left government so that we couldn't do the same. They took away a political mechanism for making the civil service work. And that is really important because as a minister, you're too busy to give every possible order. You need your special advisors helping. But they also did better than that, because when we were in office, we had a fairly informal approach to appointments, that we would tap people on the shoulder and say, would you like to take over this particular role? Would you like to be on this committee? New Labour institutionalised that and created a quangocracy who train to be quangocrats and then all get appointed to each other's quangos and make it very difficult for right-wing people to get on board. And we've had 13 years to change that, and we haven't done enough of it. We've done a little bit. We occasionally manage to appoint, it's always the great William Shawcross, who is about the one Conservative, well, he's independent, but he's the one person who isn't a complete pinko, who ever gets appointed to anything. But by and large, we go along with the New Labour appointments process. And this has cut out all sorts of first-class people, because many of the people we want to apply look on being a quangocrat as being a duty rather than an ambition. So if you go to them and say, look, it would really help if you did this, they say, okay, well, if I must, it's my duty. If you go along to them and say, look, will you send in your CV and be interviewed by some 22-year-olds? They say, thank you so much, but I'm really rather busy. And so we have cut out appointing our people to get on into the quangocracy that has become increasingly powerful. But again, we could legislate to take powers away from the quangos, which we should do, particularly since we left the European Union, because you take organisations like Natural England and the Environment Agency. When we were in the EU, they were plugged in to a decision-making process that was the EU decision-making process. We may not have liked it, but they were plugged into it. When we left, we unplugged it, but we haven't plugged it into anything else. So not only are they independent of the UK government, they're independent of everybody. And we haven't changed that, which we really should have done. So my answer to the question, the Whitehall blob frustrating reform, yes, absolutely it is. But advisors advise and ministers decide, and we should never take the easy option and say it's all too difficult, it's all impossible, we've got terrible civil servants and therefore we must just give in. We should say, how do we change this? Because it's our actions, it's legislation that has done this. There is one exception, which I will tell you about, and then I'll finish, which was an absolute and deliberate thwarting of something we were trying to do. So, whatever it was, 15, 18 months ago, Boris Johnson decides that the civil service shall be reduced by 91,000. And I'm the minister given responsibility to do that. I noticed yesterday that's now going to be 66,000. So we're moving in the right direction, but not enough. One of the things we propose doing is stopping the fast stream. Now, the civil service hated the idea that we were going to stop the fast stream. But we agreed it at Cabinet. We had an away day Cabinet meeting, Stoke-on-Trent. And last item of business was cancelling, great place to go, cancelling the fast stream. Okay, so we get back, we think this decision's been made. Oh no, Minister. That part of the meeting was political Cabinet, and therefore the decision wasn't in fact made. And this was absolute nonsense, because the Cabinet Secretary was there and he leaves for political Cabinet. Nonetheless, it was deemed not to be a proper decision. So we then make the same decision at the board of the Cabinet Office, because the fast stream comes under the Cabinet Office. Oh, Minister, no, the board of the Cabinet Office isn't a decision-making body of that kind. It didn't have the authority to make that decision, so the fast stream must continue. Unless, of course, the Prime Minister gives a specific instruction that this is what should happen. Okay? So then, without anybody telling me, but fortunately I found out, a minute is prepared for the Prime Minister, explaining why he must not get rid of the fast stream. And it's got all sorts of stuff in it. I mean, it's fair old rot as it happens. Fortunately, a helpful civil servant brings it to my attention, and I send in a counter-minute to the Prime Minister, which I actually send to him twice to make sure that he gets it, once privately and once in the formal route. And I then get a WhatsApp message from the Prime Minister saying, I've told them to do what you say, at which point the decision was made. But it gets worse, or better. Then, of course, Boris leaves government. And whilst I am still a minister in the Cabinet Office, the draft is prepared, the brief is prepared for my successor, explaining why the fast stream must not be cancelled. And on the day Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister, the fast stream is reinstituted, and it's still there. So yes, sometimes they deliberately, actively frustrate a clear order and instruction from the government, but mostly it's ministers' fault. We need to take charge, we need to legislate, and it must be a real task for Conservatives to grasp the levers of power.
Thank you very much, Sir Jacob. Alex.
So I'll start with the obvious answer is no, because Rishi Sunak was asked, does the Blob exist? And Rishi Sunak said no. So obviously, as good Conservative Party members, everyone here should go along with that and deny the existence of the Blob, which I thought was an interesting insight into the mind of the Prime Minister. Let's assume that it does exist in some format, and then sort of interrogate what that is. It's not individuals. It sort of trivialises things to sort of... and one of the things that's fascinating about politics is how much shouting goes on. And shouting is what happens when you don't have power. Shouting is what happens when you are frustrated by a system. And rather than being frustrated at the system, you should really go away and think about how you change the system rather than shouting at some poor official, even if they are being obstructive. I'll sort of run through 6 bits. As you can tell, I clearly think the Blob of some kind exists. The civil service is not appointed in this country in any way, shape or form, really, compared to other countries. Almost all other countries have an executive that sweeps in and sweeps out. That's not just America, although America is the prime example. We've decided that we want an entirely, pretty much unappointed civil service. That's one thing that means that you accumulate power. In the way that Jacob has described, you basically have a series of things that carve away the power of the democratically elected government, not in a kind of healthy checks and balances way, because the rule of law should always apply. I mean the actual ability to make decisions that you have been elected on your manifesto to implement. Then you have the Quango state, which has limited accountability. Then you have lots of Quangos that disperse huge amounts of money and make huge amounts of laws in this country. They are also unaccountable. So you don't have an appointed civil service, you have a Quango state. Then you have legislative accumulation, the point that Jacob touched on with the Equalities Act or the Climate Change Act. So you tie their hands of your successor unless they explicitly say, which they're very rare, loath to do so, and you create this sort of legislative accumulation which drives policy in particular directions. You then have sort of the structure of government, the way consultation works. There are all sorts of... Yes, Minister is an interesting one, where it's not so much as someone once said, it's not a comedy, it's a documentary, where you have the structure of government. How do people lobby government? Who are the vested interests are entrenched within the power structures of Whitehall. This tends to mean you get collusion between big business or vested interests and departments. So you end up with a ever greater accumulation of government action because there's a structure of consultation that isn't really about what consumers want or what public sector people want. It's about what trade unions want, it's what big business wants, it's what other people who are not necessarily acting in the best interests of the country, but in their own interests want. Then you've got the judiciary and legal activism and the growth of this, the increasing... Rwanda is a good case study where the idea that the Rwandan scheme was illegal is bizarre. The idea that the Rwandan government doesn't want £140 million, which is what they've been offered, in order to take a relatively small amount of asylum seekers is mad, but that's the idea that they would break that by sending people on, but that's what the judges decided, despite there is no evidence in favour of that, but the judges decided that that's what they thought would happen, therefore the policy was illegal. And then the 6th one is sort of social pressure, and this is the sort of people at dinner parties in North London, which gets far too much airtime because it's merely a function of the other 5 sort of elements. I'm not going to sort of talk through all of those. I think they all exist. I think they also tend to reinforce one another. So you end up with, if you have a civil service that's not appointed and a quango state with limited accountability, and legislation that pushes people in particular ways, and vested interests that have access in a way that other people don't, you do tend, over time, to have a government that is less responsive to the wishes of the electorate than you might hope. What's interesting instead is when this is discussed, the way that it is attacked so fiercely by various people. So if you say, well, actually, we should probably have more appointed civil servants, then it's seen as, this is basically the end of democracy, where we will have a politicised civil service. And almost every country in the world has a much higher number of appointed officials and appointed people within their government. That doesn't mean that they are not democracies. But the way it is talked about, you can tell that this actually is obviously going to change the structure of power in this country in a way that large amounts of people in London and the establishment are uncomfortable with, because otherwise they wouldn't make slightly hysterical points that are clearly out of kilter with reality. The accumulation and day-to-day things like the Climate Change Act and the Equalities Act, which push things in particular directions, do have a constant running thread where you have to basically say, as a government, we will repeal some of these things unless you want the officials to have their hands tied. It is not the officials' fault. They are having to tell you that this action is contrary to what the government has done. Government wants, because the government, in theory, wants the objectives of those acts. Because if it didn't want them, as Jacob has pointed out, it would repeal them or amend them. But if it chooses not to do so, it can't then blame officials. There is a strange element where the quangocracy, again, is seen as a part of a check and balance. Like, the idea that when democracy was being sort of created and the rule of law and all these things were coming into existence, that being able to remove quangocrats would somehow be, you're basically up there with Viktor Orban if you think that people who run large, powerful, day-to-day bodies of government should be perhaps accountable to the democratic elected ministers. This basically, the media will sort of go, this is basically Viktor Orban style. The idea that someone who is spending billions of pounds or making day-to-day laws should be removable by an elected Secretary of State, that gets put up there as some kind of this is an assault on democracy itself. You're a radical for even daring to do it. So those 6 power structures do create an overlapping blob in the sense that they constrain democratic elected governments from doing things that people in this audience and people who have voted for the Conservative Party would like to see. But bluntly, the Conservative Party since 2010 has been in power. All of 6 of the things that I have listed could be dealt with. You could appoint more parts of the civil service. You could make the quango state more accountable. You could repeal the legislative accumulation that forces you to act in particular ways. You could change the structure of government and constitution, how it works. You could make the judiciary more accountable and find ways to reduce legal activism. And the social pressure point is kind of pathetic. If you can't stand up to people at a social dinner party, then why on earth are you in politics in the first place? The problem then is not the blob, and I'm sort of agreeing with Jacob really. The problem is that the party that has been in power since 2010 that has done nothing to change any of these things. There's an element as well that the more you try and do, the more you will end up with, quotes unquote, a blob. Ministers can only do a certain number of things each day. They cannot, if your desire is to ban X, do X, to nanny people, to constantly control more and more of the economy, more and more of society, you will end up with a quango state, with a blob, with an increasing level of judicial activism because you have created laws that do that. So you have a limited state, an effective state, go hand in hand with removing the power of the blob. And here we get to something where I'm probably going to disagree slightly with Jacob. And this is Toryism, which the sort of Ed West, Lord Salisbury, Tim Stanley, who is a great journalist, wrote, "The job of Toryism is not to change things, but to manage an inherited order well." If you think the job of the Conservative Party is to, quotes unquote, manage an inherited order well, and I'm not picking on Tim because I think he's bad, I think he's very good, he's a great journalist and I enjoy reading him, but that is probably a good definition of Toryism. The problem is, doing all the things that I've just suggested are in some way radical. They are in some way departing from the inherited order. They are in some way changing things in a way that is not, quotes unquote, Tory. Toryism is the sort of complacent establishment, no change. We don't really want to upset people. We definitely don't want to make a fuss. The problem for the Conservative Party is Toryism, as Toryism struggles forwards, since 1992, the Conservative Party as a whole has only won when Brexit was on the ballot paper. There was a weird belief from the 20th century that... have I got much time, or do you want to wrap up?
Probably need to wrap up.
Okay, I'm literally down to my last couple of paragraphs. Toryism since 1992 has not managed to win an election. It's only won when Brexit was on the ballot paper. In fact, since 1974, it's only won when Margaret Thatcher, or Thatcherism, or Brexit has been on the ballot paper. What is necessary is essentially a leader who understands the need for reform and is prepared to take on the blob, rather than too many politicians who are interested in grandstanding. And the most interesting thing for me has been the change in tone since the leadership election last summer, when Kemi Badenoch ran and basically started going, well, actually, why on earth does the Conservative Party continue to not reform these institutions? Isn't actually being part of a free marketeer and a functioning small state. If you believe in a functioning state, you have to understand the power of the state and reform things. And I think since the leadership election, which obviously she lost and Liz won, but since then I think there has been a bit of an understanding that if you don't get to grips with this, you won't get to grips with literally anything else.
Thank you very much. Greg.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by making clear that I fundamentally agree with Sir Jacob that ministers are the ones that have to decide this. We can't just blame everything on the blob. We can't blame everything on the civil service. That is the established order, and we have to look at ourselves. We have to look at other parties in the past when they've been in government to understand that. Clearly, I equally don't have the direct ministerial experience that Sir Jacob has and that Ranil has had as well. But I have had an insight as a backbencher for the past few years into some of these issues and some of the battles I have taken on that perhaps some of the things I've said in those will explain why I won't get that ministerial experience anytime soon. And I'll just pick a few of them to go through to explain why I do think there is a strong case for reform, why there is a strong case for ministers to get that greater grip over the civil service that I don't believe has always been there. And the first one that I actually am immediately drawn to as an example is something that Priti Patel said when she was Home Secretary. She came and did the annual dinner at my association and talked about this, and that was just after the Nationality and Borders Act had received royal assent. There was a clear direction from government. There was a clear will that we had to stop the illegal trafficking of people across the English Channel, smuggling of people in the English Channel. The Nationality and Borders Bill, as it was then, was our vehicle at the time to do that. We've since had to legislate again, may have to do so again in order to solve that problem. But Priti was very, very open that segments of that bill she had to physically sit up through the night as Home Secretary, drafting and writing herself. Now, some might argue that that's a very good thing for a Secretary of State to be doing, to have that direct control, that direct input into legislation that is in front of Parliament. But the reason she had to do that was because that which came through from her civil servants in the Home Office simply didn't do the job that we knew as a parliamentary party that we had to do and that we eventually got through Parliament. I think it was one of those times where we had 12 back-to-back divisions or something like that at the end of that legislation in order to get that bill as good as it needed to be at the time. And sticking with the Home Office, I was very fortunate last year when many colleagues have never come out of the private members' ballot. And my third year in the House of Commons, I came out number 3 in that ballot. And I knew that there was a particular bit of legislation I wanted to try and pilot through. And it's around preventing, measures to prevent the theft of equipment, the theft of agricultural equipment, trades vans being broken into and power tools being stolen and things like that. And I went to the Home Office and I pitched this idea, and initially you get the no, and then you try again, and you keep trying again, until eventually they came back and officials in the Home Office consented, think about that for a moment, that I should bring forward a bill that very explicitly only talked about measures to prevent the theft of quad bikes. Now, in its own right, preventing the theft of quad bikes is still an important thing to do. Farms up and down the country, estates up and down the country suffer very badly when they have equipment like that stolen. The quad bike has become akin to the sheepdog for many shepherds and so on. So when it's gone, you really struggle. So I thought, okay, well, these ideas about getting forensic marking onto the equipment, I'll run with it with quad bikes. And so we went through. Now, admittedly, this was also at a time where I think I went through 4 or 5 policing ministers in rapid succession negotiating this. But we got to the point where it was all signed off within the Home Office that it would just be about quad bikes. Until we get to the point, and to his credit, he has been a hero on this, Chris Philp was appointed the policing minister, and we get the bill into Bill Committee, and lots, I make a speech saying, and actually in time I want to see this apply to GPS units on tractors and other agricultural equipment and chainsaws, and actually, when a builder or a carpenter or a plumber or whoever gets their van broken into and their equipment stolen, it massively affects their business, their ability to do work for days or weeks on end. I want these measures around forensic marking that stops the stolen items being monetized by the thieves. I want this bill to apply to that. Because it was the civil servants all along that had stopped it applying to more. And Chris Philp then from the front bench in the Bill Committee said, I don't know why we're not doing all of that straight away. And now we are in a position where my private member's bill is now an act, and secondary legislation is picking up the pieces to make it apply to all of those other things that will make a real difference to people's businesses and lives up and down the country. Let's take another example, a battle I have picked. I think I may have even raised it with Jacob when he was leader of the House in that wonderful Thursday morning session that us mortals on the back benches get to raise with the leader of the House of Commons. The whole spectre around HFSS, the high in fat, sugar and salt, where successive health ministers and ministers in DCMS, because this affects advertising regulations, have been constantly fed a narrative that if we don't crack down on HFSS, if we don't do this, that and the other, then we're presiding over some sort of evil obesity crisis. Bear in mind, on the list of things that are on the naughty list, it includes porridge, butter, things that just everyday staples. And the civil service kept pushing to successive ministers, this has to happen or obesity is going to be out of control. Whilst at the very same time putting other reports in front of those very same ministers and into the public domain that showed all of those measures. And to give you a context of that, the hit on ITV alone as a public service broadcaster from the loss in advertising revenue would be the equivalent of what they spend on regional news. All of those measures put together would still only prevent a child eating the equivalent of half a Smartie a week. So on one hand, if we don't do it, we're presiding over an obesity crisis. And on the other hand, we are preventing the consumption of half a Smartie. I think there is baked into the system a flaw in scrutiny, a flaw in ensuring that ministers are getting the best possible advice that they can so that they can act in the British interest and in a sensible interest of things that are actually going to work for the country. I could rant on about HS2, and there are plenty of examples within that as well. I won't rant on about it, but just leave you with the thought that when I asked Mark Thurston, the former chief executive of High Speed 2 Limited, did he actually have anyone on his staff? And bear in mind, HS2 is entirely taxpayer funded. They might not be technical civil servants, but they are as good as. Did he actually have anyone on his staff that understood farming? Not sure he actually understood the question. He certainly wasn't able to give a categoric answer that he had anyone at all with any knowledge of soil health, any knowledge of what happens if you start digging channels in the wrong place or concreting over fields and so on. It is that attitude that is baked in that doesn't act in our interest that I think very much does need that reform. It needs the greater scrutiny. But I end where I began in agreeing with Sir Jacob, that it's actually us that needs to make that difference, either as backbenchers challenging ministers, or more importantly, the ministers we do have stamping down a little bit harder.
Thank you very much, Greg. And by the way, if you would like to see Greg Smith MP rant on about HS2, may I recommend that you go to the IEA's YouTube channel and check out our panel yesterday on railways, the future of railways, in which Greg, I'm sure, gave a star turn about HS2. And last but very much not least, Ranil.
Thank you. So, the danger of being last is everything's been said, right? But I might not be in the right room to say this as my first contribution, but I just want to first of all defend a number of people in the civil service, in fact a good number of people in the civil service, good officials, who join the civil service for the right reasons, and indeed I'd say this is true of the vast majority of MPs on both sides of the House. People enter public service, I think, disproportionately for all the right reasons, to serve this country. And I do think it's important we say that, because we want to get the very best people to join the public service, one way or other, whether that's in civil service, whether that's in politics, whatever it might be. And if we do only talk down, only highlight the failures, of which there are many, unfortunately, but if we only talk about that, then we will never actually improve our system. And I think it is important that we recognise there are so many good people. But part of the problem that we face is that the system that we find ourselves with was a system invented in 1854. The world was a very different place back then. And I'd observed that actually Britain ran a lot more of the world back then, and Parliament sat for a fraction of the time too. And so my contention is that we not only have to modernise our civil service, we not only have a need to make sure that the machinery of government works better, but we also, I think, in Parliament, need to think about whether we simply have too many laws today, whether we create too many laws as a solution to all of our problems, and as a result of that, whether we have too much government. I want to come back to that in a second, but I also want to observe one point that's already been mentioned, which is that it's absolutely crucial that we have effective ministers too. And I don't think you can blame officials if a minister hasn't actually said no to them. And that's really important. We've got to take responsibility as politicians for actually getting stuck in and into the weeds on policy proposals that come to us. It's very, very easy to simply be impressed by civil servants saying, Minister, I think it's a very good idea, that you'll get a lot of credit for doing this, sign here, please. And actually, it takes a bigger character to say no, or to ask why, or to challenge the premise of why this has been brought forward more deeply. And I think we need to encourage that, and that should apply for whoever is in government, whichever party is in government, because that means that government works as best as it possibly can. But in terms of too much law, there are just too many quasi-constitutional laws, I think, that have hamstrung the British state over the last 25 years. The Human Rights Act's already been mentioned. I think the Constitutional Reform Act is actually one of the worst pieces of constitutional vandalism that we have seen. Constitutional law isn't exactly the sexiest thing out there, and I get that. But I'm sorry, Jacob. But it is super important, and that has fundamentally changed the relationship between Parliament, government, and the judiciary, and of course the Equality Act too. And why are all of these things important? Not because the civil service is necessarily using them to obstruct things, though sometimes that might be the case, but because activist groups, very well-funded activist groups out there with their, and sorry for any lawyers in the room, but you're not going to be this group of lawyers, the lefty lawyers who do the judicial reviews day in, day out, often funded by us as taxpayers. They are the people who are weaponising our own constitutional law against us. And we have been in government for 13 years, and we need to do something about it and fast. Otherwise, we have no one else to blame. Also, arm's length bodies, and sorry for the canter, but I don't want to repeat stuff that's already been said. Arm's length bodies, quangos, as they're often called. I was at DEFRA briefly, but I discovered that these arm's length bodies, these quangos, are so independent that where something goes wrong, it's your fault as a minister. Where you want to change something so that something doesn't go wrong, they're independent, and you can't touch them for 5 years until you get given a short list of people that you might be able to appoint who all agree with the status quo. The communications department in DEFRA was 100 people, and when I asked them, well, can you actually enforce my policy, the government's policy, on all of our arm's length bodies? The answer was no, because they are separate, they are accountable to their boards and no one else. This is part of the problem in our system. The structure of our system has to change. And then the last point on the structure, this idea that we have to consult on absolutely everything all the time, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. There's a reservoir that, sorry if you've heard this already, there's a reservoir that is proposed for Cambridgeshire. Why do we need to build a reservoir in Cambridgeshire? Because we need to build homes in Cambridge. And we've known that there's been a need for water in Cambridgeshire for 10 years or more. This reservoir, we're not going to start, in fact, building it till 2029. Between now and then, we're just going to talk about it even more. How stupid is this? And we haven't touched this system. And by the way, the reservoir won't actually be built till 2039, another 10 years later. I mean, this is just absurd. So my contention is this is as a result of 25 years of consensus. And if, I'm afraid I disagree with Alex, I think conservatism should be about changing things where things are broken. And that's what Margaret Thatcher did. And I think we should be bold in the years ahead. We need to challenge that consensus. We need to shatter that consensus if we're to make Britain grow again, if we're able to make Britain free again. Big government has been the problem, and it is not the answer. So when people voted to take back control from Brussels bureaucrats, they didn't mean we need to hand it to Whitehall. We need to now make sure that we're delivering a smaller, more accountable government that puts people back in control of their own lives. And I'm afraid that super sexy topic of constitutional law is absolutely at the heart of it.
Thank you very much, Ranil. I'm going to come to the audience in just a moment, but first, just one quick question, just going from left to right. And this, hopefully, Alex, will let you come back against the slur against your reputation that Ranil just inflicted on you.
Sorry, Tim.
So, as all four of you have said, the Conservatives have been in government for 13 years now, and nothing has been done about this. And I guess what I would actually quite like to hear from you is why has nothing been done about this, and what gives any of us any confidence that something will be done about this the next time the Conservatives are in government?
Yeah. Well, very briefly, I mean, I'm afraid we saw over the space of 49 days what happens when you do try and do something about it. People do try and take you down. We tried between DEFRA and DLUC to sort out nutrient neutrality and come up with a sensible compromise, but that wasn't good enough for so many environmental organisations who can challenge us at every term and are far better resourced than any ministerial office is ever going to be. I think the challenge we face is that after 13 years of government, it is much harder to do something than on day one. And, whatever happens at this next election, if we win this next election, we've got to make sure that on day one we come in to reform. You're never stronger than you are on day one, and you've got to have a plan to go. In defence, though, of our party, in the first 5 years, and therefore our day one, was in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and it did. Time. It did tie one arm behind our back. So we must recognise that that has been a challenge, a quite unique challenge for us as a party. It doesn't mean we can't do better in the future.
Alex.
So I wasn't criticising the Conservative Party. What I meant to is there's a certain habit of mind which I call Toryism, which the Wets in the days of Thatcher embodied, who were basically like, don't shake things up, keep things as they are, never change anything. And that's why I was quoting Tim Stanley. That version of Toryism, I think, has been dead a long time, but there are still many practitioners of the sort of zombie art of it, and I don't think it's suitable now. Margaret Thatcher, of course, was not that kind of Tory. She was in many ways a radical, but she was radical in a different sense to Liz, who I had a lot of time for and think was treated badly. But Liz was not interested in the institutions. Liz, in the leadership election last year, there was a clear divide between some of the right-wing candidates where, for example, Kemi Badenoch talked about the institutions and talked about the quangocracy and talked about things, and Liz talked about tax cuts. And it wasn't because Kemi Badenoch doesn't believe in tax cuts, for example. It was because she basically worked out if you don't reform the institutions and the structures of government and do all these difficult things, you won't have tax cuts, and in fact, you probably won't be in power that long. And that, to me, illustrates will the Conservatives get this right? It entirely depends on who the next leader of the Conservative Party is. If the next leader of the Conservative Party is a Tory who doesn't want to change very much, then I don't suspect very much will change. If someone is elected who wants to do the intellectual hard work of working out what these power structures are and how you reform them and how you make everything work, then I'm quite optimistic. I obviously have a particular person in mind, but it could be someone else. The key will be who is the next leader of the Conservative Party, assuming that Rishi does not take on the Blob. And that is a fundamental question for whether or not this country, I think, gets out of the rut it is in. I don't think Keir Starmer will get us out of the rut we're in. So I think I've sort of answered both questions there. And I'm optimistic that the Conservative Party will make the right choice when it comes to choosing the next leader. And I'm optimistic that next leader will then be able to do the things that are necessary.
Thank you. So, Jacob.
Sorry.
Decision-making in government is completely sclerotic. And Alex is absolutely right. We get nowhere if we don't do something about it. And I did look at this when I was Minister for Government Efficiency. And I got from the files, which you can all get because it's released under the 30-year rule, what Margaret Thatcher did when she wanted to have a similar efficiency drive to reduce the civil service. And the then Cabinet Secretary, Robert Armstrong, provided a minute for her prior to the Cabinet, which said the Cabinet may decide, and listed 10 or 12 things that the Cabinet might have decided at that meeting to make the civil service more efficient. You then have the Cabinet minutes, which were what the Cabinet had decided, which was pretty much the same. And what was important about this is that then this was the cross-government decision, implementable by every department, the responsibility of every minister by collective responsibility. That system does not take place. Ranil and I sat in cabinets. In no cabinet I sat in was a decision made to do anything. The minutes reported that the cabinet has taken note. Cabinet subcommittees have the authority of the cabinet to make decisions. Not once did I sit on a cabinet subcommittee that made a policy decision that was then binding across government, because the civil servants would say, the ministers here aren't senior enough, it needs to go to right round. When you go to right round, you are delaying by a month, possibly 2 months, and it's an opportunity for everybody to throw spanners into the works. Alex is absolutely right. Whether you call it Tory or not, I might quibble on that. It is essential that you know how power operates. And Tony Blair was brilliant at that, and we have been hopeless. Ranil set out the excuses for why we've been hopeless, which are absolutely valid. But any new Conservative government with a mandate on day one must work out how it exercises power, how it takes charge of the quangos, how it appoints to the civil service, whether it has a more political civil service, how it makes cabinet government function. And by that, I don't mean having long discussions and wittering on. I mean using the means of the state to make decisions. How do you make legislation work? I would love a government to come in that had already drafted its key half-dozen bills so that you get them into Parliament and through Parliament within the first 3 months, rather than having the first 3 months carrying on bills from the previous government because you haven't got anything else to do with the parliamentary time, which is what happens at the moment. I mean, I could tell you about the divorce bill which went through, that got no-fault divorce, which the day after it went through, a senior figure, very senior figure, said to me, well, why on earth did we pass that rubbish? Well, the reason we passed that rubbish was been decided on by the previous administration, and we didn't have any other legislation written and ready to be passed. That is not the way to govern. I mean, I could not agree more with Alex. It's about grasping the levers of power when you've got them.
Thank you. Greg.
I find it difficult to disagree with anything that Jacob just said there. I would say on this challenge of, well, we've had 13 years, and I don't want to sound like an excuse maker, but I think we do have to understand the history of what went on in those 13 years. The first 5 years had the obvious drag anchor that was the Liberal Democrats preventing any serious conservative reforms, although it wasn't a total disaster of a period. There were some good things done there, but the Liberal Democrats were the drag anchor. Then we had that very narrow majority between 2015 and 2017, but again, that very quickly became a period dominated by, in a good way, the referendum that saw the British people decide that we should leave the European Union. Then everybody knows what happened after that, where British politics became entirely paralysed by an inability for Parliament to make a decision to honour the will of the British people until the 2019 general election, when I had the good fortune to be elected and become a member of Parliament, where we all thought we've finally got an 80-seat majority we can get on and we can do, and the pandemic struck, and within 3 months of being a member of Parliament, we were all sent home for a period, and everything got dominated by the response to the pandemic over that time. So I think that historical context is an important one to focus on. We have done good things in the 13 years that we've been in power, not least we have left the European Union. But as Jacob said, that was the tool. We need to actually now use the tool to make something.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take questions in batches of 3, and I would invite both questioners and answers to be as short as possible in the interest of getting as many questions in. Delino, first question down here in the front row. Second question, the gentleman with the grey hair, a couple of rows back. And third question, that gentleman just behind you.
Mike Newton from Stoke-on-Trent. I want to ask the panel, particularly in terms of what Sir Jacob said about grasping and utilising the levers of power, what they think about the future of the Bank of England. And I also want to make a very quick point on what Ranil said. 25 years of consensus, to my way of thinking, has been quarterbacked by very cheap money and low interest rates. And I think that's now come to an end, and that will concentrate minds to be more radical. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
I'm Paul Worsterman from the Bethnal Green and Bow constituency. Thank you very much for that. It was really enlightening. Just for the layman in the audience like me, is it possible that you could put together, say, half a dozen references to some of the things you've been talking about, papers you're aware of, reports, that sort of thing, and stick it on the website, either the IEA or the Free Market Forum, so that those of us who aren't experts or don't know that much about the details of this can read up on it, because I think what you're saying is so constitutionally significant. I think the rest of us who aren't specialists in this field could usefully have that.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Hi, Adam Green from Queen's Park. Who's going to do the thinking? So I think one of the points that was made was that when Tony Blair came in, he was very efficient and effective, and that was because there was a lot of people who'd spent the time preparing. Who's doing the work now?
Greg, let's start with you this time.
Who's doing the work now? Well, hopefully the Free Market Forum is going to play a part in that. There are many groups actually operating in Parliament now. Maybe you could argue, perhaps, it might be heresy in the think tank to say, but maybe too many groups all fishing in the same pond. But I think there is some good work, whether it's the group that Ranil chairs around growth, or whether it's Conservative Way Forward, which I also chair, the Free Market Forum, the think tank world, is still producing good ideas. And we can't lose sight of the fact that politics is the battle of ideas, and we can't be frightened to get stuck into that debate and to find better ways of doing things. That's kind of the point of us in many ways. Always open to ideas, and I'll certainly rise to the challenge that was set in another part of the room to perhaps use one of the vehicles that I chair or one of the others to write some of that up and get that thinking going. There are actually some very simple things that we could do. And I'm going to raise a real bugbear of mine. And it's a linguistic point, but actually it's one that I think has shifted the political debate significantly. And again, from something Sir Jacob said earlier about the intellect or the rigour of the Blair administration, that Blair government did something that we carry on now, and I see colleagues, much as I love all of my colleagues, using this word in the Chamber of the House of Commons and in their articles and their leaflets to this day. And it was a word that changed the meaning of government spending. Where instead of saying we are going to spend your money on something, no matter how good or noble that thing might be, everybody now jumps up and down and talks about this wonderful investment.
Yes.
When it's not an investment at all in 99.9% of the cases. It is just a linguistic change that makes it sound fluffier and nicer and warmer than taking your money and spending it on something that perhaps you do want or perhaps you don't want it spent on. And it might sound like a little thing. It might sound like something that's just one of Smith's slight, odd, eccentric bugbears. But actually, if you don't get the language right in the first place, you're not going to make the big changes that you want to see as well. So with apologies to those colleagues that do hop up and down and talk about the wonderful investment in their constituencies, I think so long as we go along with that narrative, we're not actually going to solve the bigger problems.
Thank you, Greg. Mr. Jacob.
Well, as a minister, I banned the word investment
Yeah.
for spending. I could not. Greg is right. Language is everything. And we bought into New Labour language. It's actually, Chairman, we don't buy in to politically correct language. We don't buy in to dishonest language. Let's be blunt about it. Saying investment when you mean spending is just not true. An investment is where you expect a financial return, you expect a dividend, and you expect capital growth. It is not pouring money down a hole, which is what most government spending is. So absolutely right, and must use language. As to the thinking, I'm working with, and there are a lot of excellent think tanks. I'm particularly, obviously, do a lot with the IEA and with Legatum, who are very strong. There are a lot of ginger groups within Parliament. This conference has been brilliant at generating ideas, much to the entertainment of the press. And on the Bank of England, that's such a good question. You should all read, if you haven't already, The Price of Time by Edward Chancellor, which explains in detail why central bankers have failed. And everybody needs to be accountable. The Governor of the Bank of England is not accountable. But let me say one nice thing about Andrew Bailey, and that is he's not as bad as his predecessor.
Alex.
Yes, I think there is a lot of thinking going on about this. I don't think 2 years ago you would have had a pact. I mean, obviously, partly it's the star power of my fellow panellists, but I don't think you would have had even that notwithstanding, I'm not sure you would have had as many people coming out to discuss the Whitehall Blob. I think there has been a change and a shift in understanding of the importance of this agenda. I think that importance will continue into the future. I think the Bank of England point is a really interesting one. I mean, it's almost after one of the other first things, not quite the first thing, but one of the early things that the New Labour did was, of course, make the Bank of England independent, which at the time the Conservatives sort of cheered on. I don't think they quite really understood, in many ways, what they were cheering on. And it's having strongly agreed with Jacob, and I agree with everything he's just said about the Bank of England and the price of time and etc. The cost of time. It's an excellent book. The thing that I disagree with him on is language is everything. Language is very important, but what actually matters is the structure of power. And if you are in a meeting and you are not really in power, then you are just an actor mouthing the words that other people have written for you. And there is too much in politics where some, not the people on this panel, there are definitely some Conservative politicians who are content to be actors, mouthing the words that other people have written for them, rather than people who want to understand the structure of power and to change it in order to be able to do the things that the people of this country want to do.
Ranil.
Not to repeat anything that's already been said, but just to reaffirm the Conservative Growth Group, which I chair. We are leading some of the discussion, I hope, on economic growth and deregulation and cutting taxes. It's important each group comes up with their own area that they can really deepen the debate on, because as we have seen at this conference with the event that someone here, Sam, organised yesterday with other friends, as we saw with the event that Liz, Jacob, Priti and I were at yesterday, there is, I think, a real appetite now for a battle of ideas in the Conservative Party, and that's important ahead of an election, ahead of a manifesto, but also beyond. And we must keep that going. The Conservative Party conference must be, I was a Conservative Party member before I was a Conservative Party councillor, before I was a Conservative Party member of Parliament. It must be about party members having their say, getting involved in the debate and shaping our policy. And so I think all of this is very encouraging.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm afraid we've got time for 2 more questions, and again, I would invite everybody to be as brief as possible. This gentleman at the front here, and this lady in blue in the middle there.
I'm chairman of Newcastle under Lyme Conservatives, and I do call myself chairman. I am also a county councillor in Staffordshire. I've been a civil servant, reasonably senior, and I've been a management consultant. One thing I would say about the civil service is they put policy before management, and the top 3 tiers of the civil service are all policy wonks. They are not managers. And unfortunately, could I say that Jacob Rees-Mogg is a manager, he's made money, he knows about management and running companies. Rishi Sunak is the first person since Margaret Thatcher who knows anything about management. And we do not have enough management in our elected politicians to take on the policy wonks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Claire Cummings, and I'm one of the very few Conservatives who live in Lambeth. I'm afraid I'm not asking a question. I would like to make a statement, because I think that, as Sir Jacob, you said, we have been given excuses and not reasons. I'm sorry, but I don't think it's good enough to say that after 13 powers, and I appreciate that there was 5 years of coalition, it's not good enough to say that nothing has been done. I'm afraid, Sir Jacob, it's not good enough to say that you only became aware of things when you became a minister. I'm afraid it's not good enough to say that 40-odd days of Liz Truss showed that change wasn't possible, certainly not against a backdrop of 25 years when we've had this lack of direct accountability to the taxpayers, to the electorate, and over half of that, 13 years, has been Conservative rule. And it's certainly not good enough to have said that after Brexit came COVID, we were all sitting at home, we were all pivoting and swivelling and trying to make a living and keep a roof over our heads, look after our children, and not asking for money from the government, but instead being responsible for our own decisions. And after Brexit, surely it should have been the time for the government that is in power to see that we did not want people who were unelected or too far away from us to be accountable to have power. And that means the civil service. MEPs are too far away, and the civil service is entirely unaccountable. So I'm sorry, it's not good enough. I will always vote Conservative. I don't care who you put a blue badge on, I will always vote Conservative. But what are you going to do in the next 5 years if you do get in, because you haven't done anything over the last 13?
I think that's a very good question for everybody to wrap up on. So, Ranil, would you like to go first?
Thanks. So just in response, I'm not sure I said change wasn't possible, but I think I said we saw what happened when we tried to change in the face of significant opposition. And that does, as Alex said, show why it's so important we challenge some of the structures, change some of the structures, and indeed, if we are successful in winning, I hope that on day one we will get on and do that. And in respect of management, I agree that management's really important, but this is why we need to look at the fundamental structure of the civil service. Not because, as I said earlier, and you, sir, have been a civil servant, not because I think civil servants are on the whole doing a bad job, but because we need to have the right people in there. And, I may not be in the right place to say this, but, I'd be happy if we had fewer, actually, I'm in the right place to say this, fewer directors general, fewer directors, fewer deputy directors, but people who are better managers and better leaders more generally, and perhaps even better paid. Because I think it would be then also attractive to bring new people into the civil service to lead significant operations. If you've been I was at Lloyds Bank before I entered Parliament. If you've been a senior leader at Lloyds Bank and you then want to go to a comparable role in the civil service, you'll probably take at least a half, but probably a third home of what you were earning before. And why would rationally people do that? I think we've got to make it much more attractive.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And if I could invite the other panelists to wrap up in approximately one sentence. That would be very much appreciated.
I'll wrap it up in a slightly enigmatic. I am optimistic for the future. Full stop.
Oh, brilliant! There we go. That's
Very
easy.
good.
So, Jacob.
On policy before management, absolutely right. I was working on something for performance-related pay for civil servants. The civil servants all wanted it about policy. I wanted it about results. We didn't get anywhere, and the current minister, I think, is now wrestling with much the same problem a year later. But you're right. Yep, busted. But let us admit it frankly, as a business people should. It's been no end of a lesson. It will do us no end of good. We must make sure that we get this right in future. And Alex is right. It's about finding those levers, using them, and making sure they're connected to things. We must never think that there are good chaps working for the government who will do what we want them to. We have to get the decision-making properly made.
And Greg, final word.
I agree with what Jacob's just said. I know it is possible. And I know it's possible because I've been there in a team that's done it on a micro level, on a smaller level. Sam said when he introduced me that I used to be on Hammersmith and Fulham Council, one of the only periods the Conservatives have run Hammersmith and Fulham Council. We halved headcount, we cut council tax by 20%, all service standards went up immeasurably between 2006 and 2014. If you can do it on a local level, you can do it on a national level, you can get a grip, and there are many people in Parliament that were there at the time in Hammersmith and that have done it in other councils around the country. We just need to replicate it onto the national stage. And I share the optimism that Alex spoke of.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along, and thank you very much to our speakers. Just before you show your appreciation for them, the next.